Oh, here on the Norfolk River in Arkansas, and kind of nice conditions right now. A little bit of a extreme light overhead, but not so bad. Anyway, out there on the river right now, there's quite a bunch of fish rising to midges. And anglers tend to define midges by definition the fact that they're small species, which by definition they are. So midge fishing really in its truest sense really means at the end of the day you're fishing very small imitations of natural food sources. That could be many different species. That could be aphids, they could be ants, they could be small chironomids, small mayflies. It really doesn't matter. By definition, a midge is a small natural food source that those trout feed on. And objectively what we do from the fly fishing perspective is that we try to catch those fish fishing an artificial fly that in some way represents that food source. And in all probability, midge fishing, I guess, compared to most other aspects of fly fishing, demands a little more attention to detail, mainly due to the fact that those fish are feeding on a very small microorganism, and more to the point, their visual sight is very, very small, and that means you've got to be a little bit more precise in your presentations, how you present those flies to the fish without spooking or scaring them. But anyway, before we even get onto that water to fish, there's a number of different things we should take into consideration, and what we should always make sure we have got with us on our person before we get down there onto the water. And we'll just run through a few of those. First and foremost, let me explain to you that there can be a significant difference to whether you fish fluorocarbon line or regular nylon monofilament, for the obvious reasons. Fluorocarbon sinks thereabouts 4 times faster than regular monofilament. So that should tell you this, that if the fish are feeding very high on the surface, as a general rule, you do not want a monofilament that your fly is attached to that's going to cause your fly to sink down below the visual zone to which the fish see your fly, and therefore I'd opt to be fishing regular monofilament. Now, that is not to say that you can't add some floating agent to your fluorocarbon and keep it in the water right there up on the surface, and you can. But saying that, let's just put things a little bit into perspective. I know the situation that I'm essentially going to be faced out here with, which is, aside from those riffles, pretty slow moving shallow water, and those fish are pretty darn spooky out there. You make one bad move and you're probably going to put them down. I also know that I don't have to fish my flies at any great depth down from my indicator if I'm using an indicator for a subsurface presentation, for example, like a nymph. If I'm dry fly fishing, well, that's a different deal altogether, because I can see the fly and I can also see the fish come up and take that fly. Therefore, under these prevailing conditions, I'm probably going to opt for a fly that's got a small amount of weight to it, a minute little bead head, which could be a tungsten bead, it could be a regular plated bead, or in fact a glass bead, because I know that that's just enough weight just to get that fly a little bit down below the surface. What's also an important thing of consideration is that you have this line in different X factors. In extreme cases, we're probably going to go down to 7X where we're fishing micro small flies, and in some cases even 8X. But across the board, 7X, 6X, 5X, and 4X. And essentially those 4 diameters of line will cover almost 99% of your needs. Because bear in mind too, you've got to taper your leader system down to the termination of the X factor that your fly is going to be attached to. The next 2 essential items we should have with us are floating agents. 2 types of floating agents. The first one can be used to add additional floating ability to your flies, and to some extent on your light line tippet sections. And the second one, mucilin, I consider to be absolutely one of the most important items that any fly fisherman should carry. And this is essentially used to provide floating ability to the fly line. And I'm going to demonstrate to you something on that water in a short while that makes a significant difference between whether or not that fly line is actually floating on the surface and or below it. Because if it is below the surface, when you raise that rod, you create drag issues, you create surface disturbance. Ideally, a situation should be that as soon as you lift that line off the surface, it should come directly off the surface and not be pulled through. Furthermore, it inhibits really good effective mending, because the perfect scenario is that you lift the line off the water without disturbance or minimum disturbance. If that line is sunk somewhere below the surface, as you lift it up, well, the consequence of it is it creates drags your fly out of its drift zone. More to the point, it also creates surface disturbance, and that's visual to the fish, particularly in conditions like this. Any surface movement that you make creates shock waves that move across that stream, and fish are sensitive to that kind of thing, particularly those big brown trout, be it upstream, across stream, and or downstream. And I'll demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about there when we get on stream. So the two most important items in my book that I need to carry are a floatant, which serves the purpose of anointing my fly, and secondly, mucilin, which is used to apply floatant to that fly line to make sure it sits and rides high on the surface of the water. Next item that is important to carry is some small shot. Now, I appreciate in some areas lead is not allowed, and that's okay, you just have to get lead free. But you have essentially two ways to create weight. One is with the fly, one is with the addition of lead or a non-toxic substance attached, and or both. Now, I will tell you from experience that what you ideally need to do when you're looking toward mid-fishing, where you need to fish small flies at depth, is to use the smallest size of shot that you can get away with. And the reason I tell you that is this: if you go on stream and all you've got with you is size 1 or something like that, I guarantee you, for the best part of it, most of the time, most definitely in this kind of water, that is way too much weight. It is better to build up additional weight in smaller increments, which is what I choose to do. And by using the smaller size of shot like this, and what I mean by that is size 8 and size 6, I can either add and or take it away, and it's much more easy to control how I'm going to get that fly to fish at the productive depth. Below the surface of the water here, and it will continually sink below the surface as it moves downstream. I mean, naturally we're in a dead flat calm piece of shallow water here, but out there when you're in moving water, just the surface movement and the agitation cause that line to sink even more. And that's not what we want. See how the line's going down as the surface movement's causing that? Okay, mucilin is a product been around a very, very long time. In fact, it was originally produced for use on silk lines, and it still is. However, this particular product, you know, when it meets cold water, solidifies. And as we generally fish for trout in cold water, well, the obvious thing is that when we apply it to our fly line, it solidifies, and that provides us with the means of high level floatability for our fly line. So what we're going to do is this: we're just going to hold the fly line on the top like this, and I just kind of just pull the fly line through like this, give it a good coating. Now look at the difference. You can see how high on the surface this fly line is now sitting compared to what it did before we put the application of mucilin on. Whether or not I apply mucilin to my leader very much is determined by what it is I'm going to do out there fishing wise. As I already explained to you, you know, how you build your leader system up is dependent on what it is you want to do. Now, typically when you're mid fishing, you don't use fluorocarbon butt sections to your leader. If there's anything additionally added which is of fluorocarbon, it's the tippet section. But let me just show you something here. Watch this fly line real careful as I lift it up off the surface of the water. See how clean it comes off the surface of the water? Big difference. And generally when we lift the line off the surface of the water, we lift it off with a great deal more speed than what I just showed you right there. So here we go. See how nice and clean that was when it came off the surface, as opposed to if it was subsurface. Put it down there as a sunk line. Watch again. See all that big surface disturbance and that big V-wake it created? If you look out there on that water, there's some obvious surface activity of fish taking these little tiny microorganisms, mainly these little tiny chironomids, little tiny things, like size 32 hooks. But it doesn't necessarily mean to say that you have to adopt a
if you like to put it, a dry fly or a surface fishing mode, because often as not, the majority of those fish are feeding just a little ways below subsurface, and you may not necessarily see a rise form either. You know, they're such small microorganisms, and as I explained to you before, you know, those fish have a very, very small window that they're looking in, and objectively, what we aim to do is to fish our fly either to individual fish or into the general area where we see X numbers of fish rising. For example, 3 fish rose almost at the same time there, so I know within that zone collectively there's a number of fish, and the chances are if I fish my fly through them, one or more of those fish will see that fly. Whether they take it or not is another matter. What is a big mistake, and a lot of anglers tend to do that, is they blatantly, what I define as, fish the water. Like, pick up here, throw to this, rise there, pick up there, throw to that, rise there. And ultimately what you will do, often as not, is you'll basically put all those fish down and catch none of them. Or you may catch one and you spook the rest. Objectively, what I'm going to look to do is to fish for those fish that are closest to me first, not those that are over there. These ones here, right on the edge of this backwater slow seam, just here, as opposed to mindlessly just fishing the water as such. It's better to work on one good fish as opposed to try and catch fish here, there, or everywhere else and pretty much destroy what chances you might have had in the first place. And that's one thing about midge fishing. You got to kind of think about what you're going to do before you do it. It's not a question of just blindly crashing out there in the water, splash, criss, crash, whatever else, and then all of a sudden expect the fish to leap on your fly, because generally that ain't going to happen. Particularly so where fish that are, you know, where fish are concerned, where they've been fished over a great many times, they've been caught many times. They're not that stupid, you know, at the end of it. And more to the point, when you're fishing with small flies, it makes the situation a little more difficult too. And how do I approach them without really disturbing them or putting them down? Well, I can tell you right now, if I want to get to fish for those fish over there, I'm not going to walk across the stream towards them. I'm going to move downstream and I'm going to walk across that riffle water back behind those fish and come up on that far side. And by doing so, I'm not going to spook them out of there. These fish up here, you have to be real careful when you wade a lot of times, especially in this kind of water, because you create shock waves that move across the river, and fish can be really sensitive to that upstream, across stream, and or downstream. Typically what a lot of anglers do is a little bit of a mistake. They walk across the river and they immediately start crashing and thrashing and fishing. You know, it's best not to do that. The best thing is to just walk out there, stand still, and don't do nothing. Just let the fish settle, readjust themselves into their feeding zones, and then start your fishing. There's a rainbow here, small one. Let me just explain this too, which is somewhat of a misunderstanding, if that's the way to explain that. Often as not, you're reading angling text, well, you know, you set an indicator 1.5 times the depth of the water. Well, how do you know how deep that water is out there? The only way you're going to know how deep that water is out there, to wade out there. And guess what? The consequences of that are, there go the fish. You know, if you fish a particular piece of water on a regular basis, well, you know, ultimately over a period of time you'll get to wade around it, and you get to know what average depths are in different zones, this, that, and the other. And I guess the big question is, at the end of the day, well, how do you determine what the average depth of the water is? Well, I can tell you, right now, that's not necessarily a means or requirement of accurate assessment, purely because I know and I can see that those fish are feeding high in the surface film. They're probably majority-wise within 6 inches of that surface. So I know that if I suspend that fly somewhere in the region of about 1 foot to 18 inches below that indicator, and given the average speed of drift there, which is pretty damn slow, the odds are that those fish will see my fly. If I don't get a response, it may well be that my fly is just a little bit below the zone that they're looking to feed on the natural source. It may also be that they don't like the fly I'm fishing, so I may have to change. I may have to fish a fly that's more of an emerger, like one of those we tied yesterday. You know, there's so many different permutations that you have to go through in your mind to deceive those fish, because generally speaking, unless you're very, very fortunate and you know the habits of those fish in that river real well, the odds of you coming up with the answer off the get-go are generally not very high. But I know this river fairly good, and I know, generally speaking, if I fish small chironomid nibs, size 18s and 20s, the odds are I should get those fish to eat them. So I'm going to attach my indicator initially here, about 1 foot, somewhere in that ballpark, maybe 15 inches above. I'm going to make my indicator system with a small piece of double-sided tape. I don't need nothing big and obtrusive out there. You know, a big indicator hitting the surface of a splash and a splash is just going to spook the fish. But more to the point, it's not sensitive enough to detect those little takes, and that's really what matters more than anything else. You know, when fish take these little small flies, they don't have to rush at them and swim away with them like they would do chasing a bait fish or something. It's going to come up real gentle, and they're just going to open their mouths, and that's it. And you're going to get the smallest amount of visual indication. Sometimes you can see the fish take that. And you know, and there's a difference between what did you find is sight fishing to the fish, where you actually see the fish you're fishing for, and you see it open its mouth and you take the fly, as opposed to not being able to see the fish and looking for some other means of visual knowledge that they've taken your fly. And whether you choose to do that with a little small indicator, or in some circumstances I'll actually grease the leader system up itself to see that. It just depends on the fish. If I think they're that wary, maybe. But I also know that by just putting this little small piece of tape on there, you know, pretty much I'm not setting anything out there obtrusive. And the other option, of course, is I can put a very small piece of yarn in it there. Either one, whatever your personal choice is, that does two things. First of all, gives you recognition that the fish took your fly, and secondly, more importantly, does not cause an awareness or spook the fish away from taking your fly. I'm initially looking at fishing for these fish here that are feeding. And you need to pay close attention. I'm not going to rush out there splash at this time. I'm going to walk really, really slow. And if you watch real carefully as I'm walking, as slow as I am, I'm creating shock waves. See them moving across the water? They're moving upstream, across stream, and downstream. And so I'm just going to go real, real slow. No need to rush. I also know what my casting abilities are. I also know, relative to the angle that I'm going to present the fly, how I'm going to have to control my drift to those fish out there at this point in time. I don't want to crowd them out. I'm not going to get too close. I'm going to say somewhere around about here would be good. Okay. Work the length of the line out and eat it upstream, not over the fish. That's the first thing. Okay. I know pretty much I've got my line upstream for the relative length I want for my drift. Don't cast over my fish until I make my initial presentation. What I'm doing here, in so far as my pickup, is that I'm basically casting my line downstream to start with, which pretty much enables me just to pick up and come directly more upstream. It's kind of a quicker way of kind of loading the rod, if that's the way to explain it to you, as opposed to just pulling it off the water and making a back cast and then working my way back upstream again and across. Another way I'll pick line up is this. I'll just make a quick flick of the rod tip like that, and that kicks the line free off the surface of the water. I'll demonstrate that again next time I get the line close in here. Then we're going to raise the rod, we're going to kick down with the rod tip like this and kick the line off the water. Also, another thing too is, you know, I keep my line controlled and bunched up in my hand like this with a figure of 8 retrieve, and makes it a lot easier to control things too. You know, when I pick up to recast, you know, I can just shoot the line out my hand like this, and you know, I can control the amount of line that I let go to where I want to present the fly to the fish. Everything's nice and neat and under control. Nothing worse than having a whole bunch of line there around your feet, or try to pick it up off the surface of the water when you make a cast, because that just aggravates it, and you've got that drag, and it takes a lot to do it. If you keep it in your hand at any point in time, it's much easier to do that. And also, I'm fishing a pretty long leader here too. I got a 15-foot leader on, tapered down to 6X. If you're not careful, you'll tangle them up in a hurry. Another thing about when you fish small micro indicators is never take your eyes off them. Once you see that indicator land on the surface, don't take your eyes off it, because often in this poppy water with the white bubbles coming down, you might not pick it up again too easily. So as soon as you see it land, just Just keep your eyes fixed on it. There we go. That's exactly what we were looking for. Well, if you watch that indicator, you'll see it stop or it'll slow down, and that's the only indication I got from that fish. I didn't see him bulge the surface or nothing. I just saw that indicator slow down and just whoop, there you go. Jump in, Jimmies. That's the one thing about this midge fishing. You gotta have a lot of patience for it. You know, these fish they're not the easiest fish in the world to catch by any stretch of imagination. You know, it's on slow water, it's very clear, they can see what's going on. You better make good casting presentations. No unnecessary surface disturbance, this, that and the other, and get the right fly, get the right system set up, the odds are you're going to catch them. Another thing too, and I didn't really get to discuss this too much, but out of preference I prefer to fish midge techniques with 3 and 4 weight lines, and in some cases I've even gone down to 2 weight. You're fishing very light tippet, you don't want to instigate a severe shock when you make that initial hook set, and secondly, you know, when the fish fight on you, there's a lot more flex than a rod to absorb that shaking movement of the trout, and that's important. Fast action rods to me just don't suit what's needed for midge fishing. Okay, that's a pretty rainbow. You know, we got a number of different strains of rainbows in our river here, and he got that midge pretty dang good. Come here, little guy. There you go. Like I said, I generally don't use forceps. I just kind of like to just let them go like that. And notice too what I do with my rod. I track my rod downstream at the same relative speed as the indicator. You watch a lot of anglers, and what they do is they cast and I hold the rod here, and by just holding the rod in the same place, watch my fly line. Now it's going to start to create drag. See that? Because the line's going downstream. See my indicator dragging on the surface? Okay, what I want to do is correct that before it does that. So I'm going to make my initial cast across the stream, get my line under control, and then track my rod down at the same pace as the fly line and the indicator and the fly is going downstream. See that? It's going down at the same pace, the same rate, until I get to a point where I'm going to pick it up and recast.